Basil, I so appreciate you for all the conversations we've had in the last couple of weeks. I have some of Vice President Kamala Harris today doing what you just described. Let me play that.
Sure.
In recent days, they've been trying to portray themselves as the party of unity. But here's the thing. If you claim to stand for unity, you need to do more than just use the word. You cannot claim you stand for unity if you are pushing an agenda that deprives whole groups of Americans of basic freedoms, opportunity, and dignity.
You know, Basil, there's this thing that happens, I think, in reaction to Donald Trump, and it's amazing how much he still shapes the entire political conversation, right? People shrink in reaction to him, in response to him. And Kamala Harris has, a lot of her speeches have happened in my hours. I've been fortunate the last couple of weeks. She's grown into that space. Yeah. And where he's sort of got the Republican Party, you know, sort of slipping into all of his, you know, wrinkles and creases, she's sort of elevated the entire conversation about the contrast. And it's about everybody. And I think one of the ways that humans have adapted to Trump is to say, oh, he won't come for me. It won't be me. He's coming for everybody. I think that's clear in the 4 years of the presidency and the 4 years in sort of political exile, meeting with the likes of Nick Fuentes and Kanye, or whatever he calls himself. I mean, he will eventually come for everyone that isn't under his tent. What do you make, but just explain to me what you make of how this conversation is shaping up, specifically the things she's been pointing to.
Well, there are a couple of things. One, it shows, and you know, others have said this, that there's an incredible bench in the Democratic Party, right? That there are so many people who are so extraordinarily qualified at articulating the importance of this moment to talk about where we've been and where we have to go. But if you focus specifically on Vice President Harris, you know, one of the things that I've talked so much about is over the last few years, she has been this administration's secret weapon. She has an intersectionality embedded within her that can speak to so many corners of the party about the so many different ways in which multiple policies affect all of these communities going forward, when you're talking about black women's maternal health, whether you're talking about, you know, just racism, whether you talk about democracy. There's so many ways that she touches so many Americans in his story, in many ways that J.D. Vance's story, however made up or contrived that has been, may not really speak to who he actually is as an individual and a candidate. But she has had this ability. I'll just say this one quick thing. I don't know if you had an opportunity to really talk about this, but one of the things that really struck me about Project 2025 and what Republicans are doing, there's a movement across the country to get rid of no-fault divorces. And one could say, what is the point of that? Like, why does that even matter? It matters because we have no-fault divorces in this country so that women didn't feel, particularly in situations where they were abused, that they had to stay in a marriage where at that time it was very difficult to get a divorce if the man in the marriage didn't want you to. And when you think about where we've come now, where all 50 states actually have these no-fault divorces, and that the Republicans are trying to take that away, you have to ask yourself, like, how low are they trying to go here? There is no bottom to the policy depths that they will go to kind of pull back and reel back time. And I think what Vice President Kamala Harris has been consistently saying is there is no going back. We have to move forward. We cannot go back. There is no backsliding. And I think that message, based on everything that has been said, that has been brought out, particularly about Project 2025, I think has really and solidly laid the foundation for that. And she has been the cornerstone of it.
John Heilemann, you've covered her a long time. You both hail from California. This piece that Basil picked out to highlight from a 900-page document is interesting because it does intersect with J.D. Vance's stated positions. In an interview, he now rather infamously said women should stay in marriages, including ones that are violent. Tell me how the contrast is shaping up now that it's Trump and all things Trump, plus J.D. Vance and all things J.D. Vance.
Well, honestly, Nicole, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead in the program, but I think the contrast. I think that the contrast would require a degree of focus that, frankly, right now the Democratic side doesn't have, because they are. Not to critique Vice President Harris's event today, but honestly, they are. And you've been there in a campaign, not quite in quite this place, but you know what it's like to be underwater, and when you're besieged, and when you're having an existential crisis in a campaign. You can be trying to do some things in the world. You might be able to Vice President can have a good event. You might be able to put out an ad, but in the end, all you're really doing is fielding the incoming on the matter at hand, which in this case is whether Joe Biden's going to end up remaining on at the top of this ticket or not. And I think, what we're going to come out of this convention with is, because J.D. Vance, unlike Doug Burgum, who would have been a much harder target to do a contrast with, or unlike Marco Rubio, who is a very known commodity in American politics. Not to say that there weren't places where you could contrast yourself with Rubio's policies and points of view, but J.D. Vance was, among these three, the most incendiary, the most controversial, the one who's much furthest outside the mainstream of American political thought and of traditional Republican thought. And so there is a lot to go after with J.D. Vance. And for those people who think that Donald Trump made strategists out there who think that this was a risky pick, I say two things, always remembering the bottom of the ticket in the end doesn't really matter. It's not what people vote for. They vote for the top of the ticket. We know this from 100 plus years of political science scholarship. But it is the case that the vice presidential debate, which the Trump campaign now seems to be indicating they're willing to do the debate that the Biden campaign wants. Whether that's going to be Kamala Harris or not, that's another question. But the earlier debate in the summer on CBS, not pushing for the later debate on Fox News that they had originally pushed for, that will be, because of the fact that if Kamala Harris is still on the ticket and has not moved up on the ticket, that will be quite a thing. A couple of highly trained lawyers who will be able to do some rock'em sock'em robots on a lot of issues, and it might be a place where, because of how controversial a lot of the issues that he's embraced are, it might be a place where a vice presidential debate might matter more than they traditionally do.
Well, let's deal with the injection of sort of reality-based analysis that you started with, then, John Heilemann. There is a sense of paralysis, and I wonder if that inability to sort of dig out of the crisis mode in terms of donors, in terms of stories, in terms of Democratic officials writing letters. Jamie Raskin has a new letter out today that's searing and eloquent and devastating politically for Joe Biden. Just tell me your understanding of the state of play.
Well, look, just to say that in general, when the other party is holding its convention, although the party that's not holding the convention will try to counter-program some. That's traditionally the case, but in reality, you are the campaign. Whatever party is holding its convention is going to dominate media, and so in some ways, this actually isn't the worst week for there to be paralysis on the other side, because this was going to be the moment where the Republicans were going to have roadblock coverage, and especially after what happened last weekend with Donald Trump, that was going to get the stage is theirs this week, and the stage is his. Now, having said that, I think that for a lot of Democrats, whether they are on the side of wanting to see Joe Biden bow out or they're on the side of wanting to see Joe Biden stay in, a lot of Democrats are freaking out on top of the original freak out over the fact that we're 3 weeks into this now, and there's still not clarity and there's still not a resolution. And for all of the people who are going to say Joe Biden is making it very clear that he's staying on the ticket, I think that we have now seen that wall. This is the thing that, as you know, Nicole, in politics, you say you're staying in the race until the moment you drop out. That's true across all politicians I've ever covered. Everyone insists, I am never going to drop out, never going to drop out, never going to drop out, and now I'm dropping out. That's how it works. And so the reason that some people have always been skeptical about Joe Biden's insistence that he would stay in the race is because they've seen political history in nomination fights and occasionally at higher levels where the candidates who eventually step away have insisted, and sworn on a stack of Bibles for weeks or months that they would never leave under any circumstances, then they do. Right now, even from inside the Biden world, and I know there's been there was some pushback, a public statement that was pushing back just within the last couple hours, but reporters are now hearing from senior people inside Joe Biden's world who a week ago maintained that there was no way he was going to step down, who are now saying things like, we get it's over, it's a question of when, not whether. That is what people who work for Joe Biden, and not junior people who work for Joe Biden, senior people, not at the very senior most levels, not the First Lady, not his son, Hunter, but others who are seeing the writing on the wall. And I think that for everybody's sake, whether you're on the side of wanting Biden to stay in or wanting Biden to pull out, I think everyone would really like to, by the end of this weekend, know what the future is. I think that the tide has turned against Joe Biden, and if I had to bet, I think having the entirety of the leadership of his party now effectively telling him that he needs to step aside, would be very hard to maintain a candidacy in those circumstances. But he might. But either way, the party would be well served at the end of this Republican convention week, with not very much time before the Democratic convention, either way, to know by Monday what the answer is.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.